The morning sun was just beginning to lift over the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the dry plains. Tayan, an Apache man of quiet strength, adjusted the worn straps of his leather pack and glanced toward the distant trading post. Today, like so many days before, his goal was simple: acquire enough grain to sustain his small household for the coming weeks. Survival was measured not in grand gestures but in small, steady steps: the careful tending of fields, the preservation of food, the enduring of harsh winds and hotter than usual summers. Tayan's path led him along a narrow trail winding through sagebrush and scattered rocks. Each step crunched against the hardened earth, a rhythm that matched the beat of his thoughts. He considered the mundane tasks awaiting him at home: grinding corn, mending clothes, and preparing meals, and a quiet sense of satisfaction washed over him. Life was hard, but it was honest, and Tayan had long embraced the simplicity of his existence. Yet, even in this ordinary routine, there was an unspoken rule: nothing remained ordinary for long. As he approached the trading post, Tayan's eyes caught an unusual movement near the creek that snaked along the edge of the settlement. A figure hunched over, struggling with a bundle of belongings, clothes tattered and dust-covered, her movements frantic but careful. Tayan's instincts tightened, a familiar tension rising in his chest. He had learned long ago to recognize when a situation might require his attention, when survival instincts must override the mind's deliberations. The woman, though clearly vulnerable, carried herself with a stubborn pride. Tayan noted the traces of recent grief etched into her features, the slight slump of her shoulders, the tense line of her jaw, the glint of tears that she quickly wiped away. She was a widow, or so her demeanor suggested, and something about her presence stirred a flicker of curiosity and concern in Tayan. His gaze lingered, torn between the simplicity of his mission and the weight of human compassion. He continued toward the trading post, exchanging polite greetings with the trader, a man who had come to expect Tayan's punctual visits. As he balanced hides against measured sacks of grain, Tayan's attention kept drifting back to the woman near the creek. She was struggling to lift a bundle onto a makeshift cart, the wood creaking under her weight. A sudden misstep, a rock rolling beneath her foot, threatened to send her sprawling. Without conscious thought, Tayan set down the grain and moved toward her, his stride purposeful, his mind already calculating how best to prevent injury. The day that began with the ordinary task of acquiring grain was shifting subtly. Tayan realized that in this brief encounter, the path of his life might bend in an unexpected direction. Today, the quiet simplicity he valued so deeply could be disrupted, not by hardship or hunger, but by human connection, fragile yet undeniable. And even as he approached, the morning sun climbing higher, he felt a strange certainty. Helping her might change everything. Tayan's footsteps were deliberate as he crossed the dusty clearing toward the creek. The closer he drew, the clearer the woman became. She struggled with the small bundle she carried, a mix of worn blankets, a few personal items, and a battered cooking pot, her hands raw from friction against the rough fabric. The sight tugged at a part of Tayan he rarely acknowledged, the need to protect, to act beyond mere survival. The woman's eyes snapped up as she sensed him approaching. For a brief moment, the world between them paused. There was caution there, sharp, wary, the kind born of loss and solitude, but beneath it, a flicker of desperation that no words could disguise. Tayan stopped a few steps away, letting her gauge his intent before speaking. "You're in danger," he said finally, his voice calm, steady. "That bundle will fall if you're not careful." She stiffened, instinctively withdrawing slightly, as if bracing against a stranger's interference. "I can manage," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. Tayan noticed the strain hidden behind her defiance. the effort it took just to stand upright beneath grief's weight. "I can help," Tayan said simply, stepping closer. There was no arrogance in his offer, no demand, only a practicality shaped by years of living with the land's harsh realities. After a moment's hesitation, she allowed him to lift one end of the bundle. Tayan marveled at how much strength she carried within her frailty. Even in her weakened state, she was resolute, unwilling to surrender entirely. Together, they managed to balance the load atop the small cart. She nodded once, a gesture both of thanks and acknowledgement. Though her eyes remained cautious as they walked toward the trading post, Tayan observed her carefully. She moved with the fluidity of someone used to wilderness survival, her senses finely tuned to the environment. He recognized the signs, the subtle scanning of the surroundings, the readiness to shift weight at a moment's notice, the silent assessment of a stranger's intent. She was capable, resilient, yet clearly burdened by recent sorrow. Their conversation began cautiously, each word measured. Tayan asked only about her immediate need, a place to rest, water, safety. Her replies were guarded, tinged with pride and the remnants of grief. "I am alone," she said finally, her gaze drifting to the creek where the water trickled over sun-warmed rocks. "I have little. There is nothing I can offer." "You have your strength," Tayan replied, "and you have your life. That is enough." There was no judgment in his tone, only observation. He understood the silent language of survival, the way the Apache people measured worth not by possessions, but by endurance, resourcefulness and spirit, a sudden sound, a distant shout, or the unexpected crack of a branch made the woman flinch. Tayan's hand moved instinctively, not to seize her but to guide, steady, reassure. In that instant, trust began to build, fragile and tentative. Like a sapling pushing through the hard earth as the trading post drew near, Tayan sensed that the day's ordinary purpose, acquiring grain, was already becoming secondary. There was something about the widow, something in the careful set of her shoulders, the quiet dignity of her voice that compelled him to remain attentive. Today's journey had started as a simple task, but he realized with a strange certainty that it might very well mark the beginning of an unexpected path, one that neither he nor she could have anticipated. The sun rose higher, bathing the plains in warm light, and Tayan felt the weight of choice pressing on him. The decision was simple in principle but profound in consequence: to continue his solitary path or step into a story that was no longer just his own. The path home from the trading post seemed deceptively calm. Tayan led the small cart carefully, keeping a watchful eye on Nokomis beside him. She walked with deliberate steps, her hands occasionally brushing the bundle for reassurance. For a moment, the tension of their first encounter had eased, replaced by a quiet, cautious rhythm. Yet, in the wilderness, tranquility was often fleeting, and Tayan knew this truth better than most as they navigated a narrow bend along the creek. A sudden commotion shattered the stillness. A horse, untethered and wild-eyed, bolted from the underbrush, kicking up dust and rocks. Its riderless body thrashed against the cart's wheel, threatening to topple the grain and scatter their careful load. Nokomis froze, panic flashing in her eyes, while Tayan's muscles coiled instinctively, honed over years of responding to danger with swift, precise action. Without hesitation, Tayan surged forward. "Step back," he commanded, his voice calm yet authoritative. He grabbed the reins of the horse as it lunged, shifting his weight to absorb the animal's frantic energy. Nokomis instinctively obeyed, moving a step behind him, her heart pounding as she watched the grain teeter perilously on the cart. The struggle was brief but intense. Tayan's hands were steady, his movements fluid. He whispered soothing words to the horse, a language of patience and respect, until its panic subsided enough for him to lead it away from the cart. Nokomis, Her chest heaving, let out a shaky breath and looked at him with wide eyes, caught somewhere between fear and awe. "You saved the grain," she said finally. Her voice barely above a whisper, though it carried a deeper meaning she did not yet fully grasp. Tayan shook his head. "I saved you," he said simply. No pride, no boast, just the plain truth. For a long moment, silence fell between them, punctuated only by the distant murmur of the creek and the soft thud of the horse's hooves as it was guided back toward the trail. Nokomis's gaze lingered on Tayan, assessing, questioning, yet slowly softening. She had been alone for too long, learning to rely only on herself, and yet here was a man who acted without hesitation to protect her. It was a foreign sensation, gratitude mingled with a tentative trust, and something warmer she had thought she might never feel again. As they resumed their walk, the tension between them had subtly shifted. Nokomis's posture was less rigid, her steps lighter. Tayan, for his part, felt the faint stirrings of connection, not romance, not yet, but recognition. In a single act, they had crossed the invisible barrier that kept strangers apart in a harsh, unforgiving land. They talked quietly as they walked, sharing bits of information about the terrain, the weather, and the upcoming journey home. Tayan noticed the careful way Nokomis measured her words, the subtle hints of humor she allowed to slip through when she thought he was not paying attention. He responded in kind, a few small observations about the river's bends and the way the wind shifted over the plain. Their conversation was cautious, polite, but underpinned by an unspoken understanding. They had each survived hardship, and each had something to offer the other. By the time the outline of Tayan's homestead appeared against the distant hills, the sun hung low in the sky, painting the plains with warm orange hues. The day's mission, originally intended to secure grain, had transformed into something more profound. Tayan glanced at Nokomis, noting the faint smile tugging at her lips, and realized that life had a way of bending the simplest plans into the unexpected. Today, he had chosen to protect a stranger, and in doing so, he had unknowingly opened a door to a new chapter, one neither of them could yet imagine. The evening air had begun to cool as Tayan and Nokomis walked the remaining distance toward his homestead. The sun had dipped low behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the dusty trail. Tayan could feel the weight of the day settling on his shoulders, but the presence of Nokomis beside him kept his senses alert. She walked with a cautious steadiness, hands occasionally brushing the bundle they had saved, her eyes scanning the landscape as though expecting danger at any moment. Finally, Tayan broke the silence. "You carry a heavy load," he said simply, nodding toward the bundle. "Not just the things you hold, but what you've been through." Nokomis stiffened, a subtle tension running through her posture. She had spent months guarding her story, wrapping her grief in silence, and yet something in Tayan's calm gaze made her pause. "I have survived," she said quietly, almost reluctantly. Her voice trembled just slightly, betraying the emotion she worked so hard to conceal. Tayan's expression softened, understanding the layers behind her words. "Surviving is one thing," he said, "living is another. And living alone is never easy." There was no judgment in his tone, only observation, a recognition of her strength and her vulnerability. For the first time since their meeting, Nokomis allowed herself a moment to look at him, really look. Tayan was not a man of many words, but his eyes carried a quiet steadiness, a reliability born of experience and discipline. She could see the care he took in even small actions, the way he assessed danger and acted without hesitation. Something in that calm presence stirred a strange feeling within her, one she had not felt since her husband's death, a tentative sense of trust. "I have been alone for months," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Since he died, I have learned to depend only on myself. The world does not make room for grief." Her gaze dropped to the ground, tracing the dust with her foot. Tayan nodded, listening, his mind piecing together the story her words hinted at. "You are not alone now," he said, his voice steady, matter-of-fact. "Not if you choose not to be." He did not rush her, did not force the truth upon her. He simply offered it, leaving the choice in her hands. Nokomis considered his words, the simplicity of them belying the depth of their meaning. She had expected the journey to be mundane, focused on grain and survival, yet here she was, confronted with a man who acknowledged her humanity without judgment or expectation. The trail wound between sparse trees as twilight deepened. Tayan glanced at the distant outline of his homestead, a modest dwelling of adobe walls and a thatched roof, surrounded by fields and a small corral. "Home is near," he said. "You need rest, food, warmth, and safe ground to stand on." Nokomis's eyes flickered toward the homestead and then back to him. Pride warred with relief, hesitation with hope. "I do not know if I am welcome," she said, her voice soft but wary. Tayan shook his head. "All who seek safety and offer respect are welcome. The land is not harsh to those who honor it, nor am I harsh to those who walk carefully beside it." The words settled between them, simple yet profound, creating a fragile bridge of understanding. Nokomis felt the tension in her chest ease, just slightly, as if the weight of solitude had begun to lift. For Tayan, the moment confirmed a growing sense. Today's mission, grain and survival, had already transformed into something far more significant. He had opened a door, and Nokomis now stood at the threshold, uncertain but drawn by the possibility of something neither had expected: trust, companionship, and perhaps the slow beginnings of healing. As the first stars began to prick the evening sky, Tayan led the way, and Nokomis followed, a quiet determination in her steps. Each footfall brought her closer not just to a home, but to the uncertain promise of connection, a path neither of them had planned, but both now sensed was unavoidable. The path to Tayan's homestead stretched across the open plains, framed by the fading light of the evening. Shadows lengthened across the dry grasses, and the wind whispered faint warnings through the scattered sagebrush. Tayan walked with deliberate care, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert to every movement. Nokomis kept close, her hands lightly brushing the bundle that had become a symbol of both her fragility and her determination to persevere. For a time, the journey was quiet, the rhythm of their steps accompanied only by the soft murmur of the creek beside them. But the wilderness is seldom forgiving, and Tayan knew better than to assume the safety of calm. A sudden rustling from the brush ahead made him halt mid-step, muscles coiled in instinctive readiness. Nokomis froze beside him, eyes wide and alert, gripping the bundle with renewed tension. From the shadows emerged not a predator, but a small band of men on horseback. Strangers to the land, their intentions unclear. The leader's voice carried across the plain, rough and commanding. "Step aside." He barked, though his tone was tinged with uncertainty. Tayan's hand moved subtly to the heft of his knife, but he did not yet make a move. His years in the wilderness had taught him that violence was not always the answer. Timing, observation, and strategy often mattered more. Nokomis glanced at him, fear flashing in her eyes. Tayan met her gaze briefly, conveying reassurance without words. "Stay close," he murmured. She nodded, trembling slightly, yet moved instinctively to stay beside him. The strangers approached, their horses kicking up dust in the dying light. Tayan spoke calmly, his voice carrying over the rustle of wind and hooves. "We mean no trouble. Move along, and you will not find any." His tone was steady, authoritative, yet measured, a balance of warning and diplomacy. honed by years of navigating both the wilderness and human unpredictability. One of the men, younger and less confident, shifted uneasily in his saddle, glancing at the leader. Tayan noticed the hesitation. With a subtle motion, he positioned himself slightly in front of Nokomis, not threatening, but protective. His eyes locked on the leader, unyielding, conveying the silent message: "Do not underestimate us." A tense silence stretched between the groups, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rustling through the grasses. Tayan's calm presence seemed to ripple outward, influencing the men before him. Finally, the leader spat on the ground, muttering a curse, and signaled his companions. Horses turned, hooves stirring dust, retreating toward the shadows from which they had emerged. Nokomis exhaled, relief flooding through her. You saved us," she said, her voice a mixture of awe and gratitude. Tayan shook his head lightly, offering no praise for himself. "We protected what must be protected," he said simply. "No one should be harmed needlessly." They resumed their walk, the homestead now closer, its outline clearer against the horizon. The incident had left both of them altered, Nokomis's wariness tempered by trust, and Tayan's awareness of his own unexpected care for another human life growing stronger. The plains, though harsh and unpredictable, had provided them a rare lesson. Survival was not just about grain or shelter, but about connection, protection, and the willingness to act when another's life hangs in the balanced dot as twilight deepened. Tayan glanced at Nokomis, noting the faint warmth returning to her posture, the cautious sparkle in her eyes. The journey that began with a simple mission, acquiring grain, had already evolved into something far more profound. And as the first stars emerged, they walked side by side, aware that the path ahead would challenge them further, but also realizing that, together, they might face it stronger than either could alone. The outline of Tayan's homestead grew larger as they crested the final hill. Its low adobe walls and weathered roof seemed modest against the vastness of the plains. Yet to Tayan, it represented safety, routine, and the quiet rhythm of life he had carefully maintained. The corral's wooden fence leaned slightly in places. The small garden patch bore the marks of careful tending, and the smoke curling from the chimney promised warmth and sustenance. Nokomis paused at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene. Her body relaxed slightly, but the tension lingered. She had spent months fending for herself, relying on instincts honed by grief and necessity. Now, approaching this new space, a man's home, his territory, she felt the fragile stirrings of hope mixed with caution. Every instinct whispered both opportunity and risk. Tayan noticed her hesitation and slowed his pace. "It is simple," he said quietly. "Not grand, but it is enough. Food, water, a place to rest. You will be safe here." She nodded, her hand still clutching the bundle. I do not know if I should impose," she said. The words were heavy with pride, yet tinged with vulnerability. Tayan shook his head. "You do not impose. There is room enough for those who need shelter and respect it. That is all I ask." They reached the gate of the corral, and Tayan lifted the latch. The horses inside stirred at their approach, stamping hooves and tossing heads. Tayan's careful handling of the animals reflected his lifelong skill and patience. The animals trusted him, and in turn, he trusted them. Nokomis watched silently, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips, small, fleeting, yet genuine. Inside the home, the scent of dried herbs and smoke mingled with the earthiness of adobe walls. Tayan moved efficiently, placing the bundle down on a corner bench and inspecting the grain he had purchased earlier. Nokomis remained still, observing, her eyes taking in the orderly simplicity of his home. There was no extravagance, no unnecessary ornamentation, only practicality and care. Tayan glanced at her, noting her tentative glances toward the hearth and the small cooking area. "You may rest," he said. "Food will be ready soon. The fire is warm." Her pride wavered against relief, and she allowed herself to sink onto the bench, her hands brushing against the blankets. Tayan began preparing a simple meal, roasted corn and dried meat, working silently but with a measured rhythm that conveyed both skill and calm. Nokomis watched, absorbing the ease with which he moved through his space. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life here, even if fleeting, a space of safety and routine after months of uncertainty and loss. After a while, Tayan spoke. "You do not need to speak of what has happened if you are not ready. This is a place to breathe first." His words were gentle but firm, granting her permission to exist in this space without expectation. Nokomis exhaled, the tight coil of anxiety within her easing slightly. She realized that for the first time in months, she was not planning for immediate survival. She was simply present, allowed to exist without fear. Yet, even in this safety, subtle tension lingered. She was proud, self-reliant, and wary of dependency. The home represented both comfort and challenge, a balance she had not anticipated. As twilight deepened outside, the small adobe home glowed softly from the hearth. Tayan served the simple meal, and Nokomis accepted it without hesitation, sharing the space silently but not uncomfortably. In these quiet moments, the boundaries of their lives began to shift. Survival alone had brought them together. But shared experience, small gestures, and mutual respect hinted at the possibility of something deeper. For Tayan, the day's simple mission, grain, had evolved far beyond necessity. For Nokomis, the journey had delivered more than safety. It offered the faint, fragile glimmer of trust, and perhaps the beginning of companionship she had thought lost forever. The following morning, the sun rose gently over the plains, casting golden light across Tayan's modest homestead. Nokomis awoke to the faint sound of birds and the soft crackle of the hearth, feeling an unfamiliar sense of comfort. The night had been quiet, without the intrusion of danger or the loneliness that had accompanied her for months. For the first time in a long while, she noticed how ordinary life, the smell of firewood, the rough texture of adobe walls, the soft rustle of the wind through the corral could feel like sanctuary. Breakfast was simple: roasted corn, dried meat, and water from a small clay pitcher. Tayan moved with ease, performing each task with care and precision, his quiet efficiency both grounding and reassuring. Nokomis observed, feeling a growing curiosity about this man who could make survival look so natural, so unobtrusive, yet whose presence carried a weight of protection she could not ignore. "Would you like to help?" Tayan asked, glancing at her with subtle encouragement. She hesitated, pride and independence warring with the desire to belong. I can," she said cautiously, stepping toward the hearth. Her hands were clumsy at first, unfamiliar with his routines, but Tayan guided her with gentle instruction, never criticizing, only showing. Slowly, she began to find her rhythm, stirring the pot, arranging firewood, adjusting the meal as needed. With each small task, she felt a flicker of satisfaction, a realization that cooperation did not diminish her independence. As the morning progressed, Tayan led her to the small garden patch, showing her how to tend the corn and beans. The work was hard, yet grounding, the physical labor fostering a subtle connection between them. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, punctuated only by the sounds of wind through the stalks and the occasional rustle of a rabbit in the underbrush. In these quiet moments, Nokomis began to sense the unspoken rhythm of Tayan's life, practical, disciplined, yet imbued with a quiet empathy. By midday, they returned to the homestead, dusted and warm from labor. Tayan handed her a small bundle of herbs he had gathered, simple but fragrant. "For the evening meal," he said. The gesture, small and unassuming, carried more meaning than words could convey. Nokomis accepted it, her fingers brushing his briefly, a fleeting contact that made her heart quicken in a way she had not expected. Over the next days, routines began to form. Nokomis discovered a strange comfort in the predictable flow of chores, in the quiet companionship of a man who acted without expectation. Tayan, in turn, observed her resilience, her intelligence, and the subtle humor that occasionally surfaced despite her grief. Their interactions, small at first, arranging firewood, preparing meals, tending animals, gradually built trust, a fragile yet growing bond. Yet tension remained. Nokomis struggled with vulnerability, cautious of leaning too heavily on another's support. Tayan, accustomed to solitude, faced the subtle challenge of accommodating another life within his carefully ordered existence. These small frictions were never loud, but they were real, a testament to the delicate balance between independence and connection, between pride and the quiet need for companionship. By the end of the week, a subtle transformation had begun. Nokomis laughed softly at a small joke Tayan made while tending the corral. Tayan noticed the light in her eyes, the easing of her posture, the faint warmth in her voice. What began as mere cooperation was shifting towards something more profound: mutual respect, trust, and the quiet beginnings of a partnership neither had expected when the day started simply with grain. As twilight fell once more, Tayan and Nokomis stood outside, surveying the plains together. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and in that shared silence, they both recognized a subtle truth. Life was no longer just about survival, but about finding someone with whom survival could be shared. And perhaps in time, more than just survival might be possible. A week had passed since Nokomis arrived at Tayan's homestead, and the quiet rhythm of shared chores and routines had begun to settle comfortably around them. Yet the plains rarely allowed for uninterrupted peace. That afternoon, as the sun beat down on the sparse grasses and the wind carried faint dust, a distant shout pierced the horizon. Tayan's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his knife, his body tensing as he scanned the line of hills that separated them from the open prairie. Nokomis, who had been tending the small garden, stiffened beside him. Her eyes reflected a mixture of fear and resolve. Though she had begun to trust Tayan, months of hardship had taught her caution. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "Trouble," Tayan said simply. "Could be travelers, could be raiders. We will see soon enough." He moved toward the edge of the homestead, motioning for Nokomis to follow closely behind. Her pulse quickened, but she obeyed without hesitation. Together, they approached the top of a low rise, the plains stretching out in front of them like a painted landscape. From the distance, a small group of men on horseback appeared, dust swirling around their hooves. They were strangers, their intentions unclear but unmistakably hostile in their posture. Tayan's gaze sharpened. This was the test he had anticipated, a trial not only of skill and instinct but of trust. Nokomis, sensing the gravity of the moment, moved closer. Staying within the protective perimeter he created, Tayan spoke quietly, his voice calm, meant for her ears as much as for himself. "Stay behind me. Do not panic. We will handle this together." Nokomis nodded, heart pounding, feeling both fear and a strange sense of determination. She had survived alone for months, but now she realized the strength of working alongside someone who truly understood the land and its dangers. The strangers drew nearer, shouting and brandishing crude weapons. Tayan positioned himself in front of Nokomis, not aggressively but with unwavering resolve. His eyes locked on the leader, steady and unflinching. With precise movements, He shifted their small cart and the few possessions they had to create a barrier, using his knowledge of the terrain to control the approach. The encounter was tense, the silence between shouts almost tangible. Then, one of the riders, younger and uncertain, faltered, his horse skidding slightly in the uneven ground. Tayan seized the moment, his voice cutting through the dust and wind. "Leave now," he commanded. "There is nothing for you here but loss." The authority in his tone, combined with his calm readiness, gave pause to the attackers. Nokomis, despite herself, felt a surge of admiration. She had witnessed his skill, his courage, and his unwavering care for both her and their home. Slowly, the strangers hesitated, then turned their horses, retreating across the plain as dust swirled behind them. Tayan watched them go, eyes never leaving until the threat was gone. Turning back to Nokomis, he allowed himself the first small smile of relief. "It is over," he said, voice gentle. She exhaled deeply, her shoulders loosening. The danger had tested her trust, and Tayan's protection had reinforced it. For a long moment, they stood together, not speaking, simply breathing in the quiet that followed. Nokomis realized that, for the first time since her loss, she had felt genuinely safe, not because she had protected herself, but because someone else had chosen to stand with her. And Tayan, observing her steadying gaze, felt an undeniable shift. She was no longer merely a guest in his home, but a companion whose courage and resilience complemented his own as twilight descended over the plains. The homestead glowed warmly, a sanctuary amidst a world of uncertainty. That day had tested them both, but it had also solidified a truth neither could deny. Survival was important. Yes, but trust, companionship, and shared courage were what truly made life bearable and perhaps even worth living. The following morning brought calm, a gentle contrast to the tension of the previous day. The plains stretched endlessly under a pale blue sky, and Tayan's homestead hummed with quiet life. Birds called from the scattered trees, and the breeze carried the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. Nokomis moved about with a cautious ease, tending the small garden and rearranging the simple belongings she had brought with her. The lingering fear from yesterday's encounter had not disappeared entirely, but it had been replaced with a subtle warmth, a sense of trust in Anazvatitra. Tayan that grew with every shared task and wordless understanding. Tayan observed her from a distance, his eyes tracing the deliberate way she worked, the quiet attentiveness in her movements. She had begun to fall into the rhythm of the homestead, yet he could see the tension still woven into her posture. He understood that safety and companionship were new territories for her, and he respected her space even as he silently offered support. "I will fetch water from the creek," Tayan said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Stay here and tend the garden. The plants need your hands more than mine right now." Nokomis nodded, appreciating the trust implicit in his instructions. She moved among the rows of corn and beans, letting her fingers brush over the leaves and soil. It was the simplest of tasks, yet it carried weight. Each plant a small reminder that life persisted, even in the harshest conditions. As she worked, her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the months of solitude before she met Tayan. She had survived by sheer force of will, but now she understood there was another kind of strength, one found in connection, in sharing burdens, in knowing someone else had your back. When Tayan returned, the water sloshing in the wooden pail, he noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. There was a softness in her gaze, a tentative willingness to relax. "The water will help," he said, setting the pail down, "and the plants will flourish with care." Nokomis allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine one in weeks. I did not think I could trust so quickly," she admitted, her voice quiet, almost shy. Tayan's eyes met hers, steady and calm. Trust grows with shared purpose, he said simply, not with words alone. The day passed in quiet companionship. They worked side by side, preparing a small meal, tending the animals, and sharing occasional words about the land, the weather, and the routines that bound them together. There was no rush, no forced intimacy, only a slow weaving of lives through shared labor and silent acknowledgement of one another's presence. As evening approached, a subtle challenge presented itself, not from the outside world, but from within. Nokomis hesitated at the threshold of the hearth, considering whether to sit closer to Tayin or remain apart. Her pride and independence wrestled with a growing desire for closeness, for warmth beyond mere physical comfort. Tayin noticed her pause but did not press, understanding that patience and respect were part of the bond they were building. Finally, she moved toward the fire, settling on the mat beside him. The closeness was tentative, yet deliberate, a quiet declaration of trust. Tayin acknowledged it with a small nod, offering a piece of roasted corn. Their hands brushed briefly, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to matter. In that shared silence, they found a fragile peace, one born not from necessity but from choice. By nightfall, the homestead glowed with firelight, the plains outside stretching silently under the stars. Nokomis rested against the adobe wall, feeling the warmth of both the hearth and Tayin's presence beside her. In that quiet, she realized something profound. She had not only survived, but she had found a companion who honored her strength while offering safety. For Tayin, too, the day confirmed a quiet truth. Life had delivered more than grain. More than survival, it had brought him a partner. Someone whose courage and resilience mirrored his own, and whose presence promised that the days ahead, though uncertain, could be shared. The following morning, the plains were bathed in the soft glow of sunrise, painting the horizon in shades of amber and rose. Tayin and Nokomis stood side by side at the edge of the homestead, the wind gently stirring their hair and the scent of sage filling the air. The simple routines of the past days, tending the garden, caring for the animals, preparing meals together, had solidified into a rhythm that felt natural, almost inevitable. What had begun as a mission for grain had transformed into the foundation of a new life, one neither of them could have foreseen. Nokomis adjusted the blankets in the corner of the home, glancing at Tayin as he repaired a fence post. She no longer hesitated in his presence. The wariness that had clung to her since widowhood had begun to dissolve, replaced by a quiet trust. She realized that survival alone was no longer enough. Companionship, shared labor, and mutual respect were equally vital. Tayin, observing her attentiveness and the gentle care she brought to even the smallest tasks, understood that she had become indispensable not just in work, but in life. After breakfast, they stepped outside together, surveying the plains that stretched endlessly before them. Tayin's eyes softened as he watched Nokomis gather herbs from the small patch they had cultivated, her movements precise yet infused with a newfound ease. "The land thrives when we tend it together," he said, his voice low and calm. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time spoke without hesitation. "And so do we," she replied. The words hung between them, simple yet profound, acknowledging a partnership that had grown beyond necessity into choice, trust, and the possibility of love. The homestead, modest and unassuming, now held more than grain, crops, or shelter. It contained shared memories of danger faced and overcome, of small victories and quiet moments of laughter. The bond they had forged, through protective instinct, mutual respect, and careful patience, had transformed the ordinary into something enduring. As the day progressed, they worked together seamlessly, their movements synchronized without effort. Tayin repaired a section of the corral while Nokomis prepared a small meal for their mid-afternoon rest. Occasionally, their hands brushed, and each touch carried a warmth neither had expected to find so soon. The plains around them remained harsh, unyielding, yet within their little homestead, a sense of peace and resilience flourished. By evening, the sky deepened to brilliant hues of purple and gold. Tayan and Nokomis sat outside, sharing the last meal of the day, their silhouettes outlined against the glowing horizon. The wind carried the distant call of a hawk, the soft rustle of the grass, and the quiet affirmation of life that persisted even in isolation. Nokomis leaned slightly toward Tayan, a gesture of trust and acknowledgement, while he allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. For both of them, the journey that began with a simple task, acquiring grain, had led to something far greater, a shared home, companionship, and the beginning of a life rebuilt from hardship. Nokomis's widowhood, once a source of solitude and fear, had become the threshold for connection and renewal. Tayan's disciplined, solitary existence had opened to acceptance and care. As night fell, the stars emerged, scattered across the sky like tiny points of light guiding travelers home. Within the adobe walls of the homestead, they settled beside the hearth, the warmth of the fire reflecting the warmth of their bond. The plains were vast and unpredictable, but together, Tayan and Nokomis had found stability, trust, and the quiet promise of a future neither could have imagined. When the day had begun with nothing more than grain. In that shared silence, with the fire crackling softly and the world stretched wide around them, the truth was simple yet profound. Life, once solitary and uncertain, had delivered them each other.